The rain came down like the tears of the ancestors, each drop a hammer strike against the red earth that had known generations of footsteps. Amara stood barefoot in the downpour, her white dress torn at the hem, mud clinging to her dark skin like shame itself, like something that couldn't be washed away, no matter how hard the rain fell. The screams of her stepmother still echoed in her ears, those words sharper than any knife could ever be, more cutting than the thorns now drawing blood from her feet with each desperate step forward. Around her the village women gathered at a distance, their eyes carefully averted, their mouths sealed shut by a fear so palpable you could taste it in the humid air. No one moved to help her, no one dared. They had seen what happened to those who defied Stella, the beautiful, ruthless woman who had married into their village and consumed it like fire consumes dry wood. Amara's own stepbrothers and half-sister watched from the veranda of the mansion, some giggling nervously, others turning away because they couldn't bear to witness what was happening, what they had allowed to happen. The servants who had dragged her from the house stood at the forest's edge, their faces twisted with discomfort, but their loyalty to their employer unwavering. This was the moment when Amara's world ended, though she didn't know yet that it was also the moment when her true life would begin. Her stepmother's voice still rang in her ears, each word a weapon that had been carefully sharpened over months of manipulation and cruelty. "You are not my daughter," Stella had said that morning, her voice dripping with contempt. "You are a curse, a reminder of your father's weakness, a burden that I have tolerated far too long." The inheritance letter had been the spark that ignited this final explosion of rage and vengeance. That letter, written in her father's careful hand and witnessed by lawyers from the capital, named Amara as the sole heir to the family's vast cocoa plantations and ancestral lands. Amara had watched in horror as Stella took that document to the fireplace and held it to the flames, watching the edges blacken and curl, watching her future disappear into ash and smoke. But it wasn't just the destruction of the paper that had terrified her. It was the smile on Stella's face as she did it, a smile so wide and so filled with certainty that Amara understood in that moment that this had all been planned. Every cruel word, every small humiliation, every moment when her father had looked past her or dismissed her, all of it had been part of a larger design. Stella had been weaving a web for years, and Amara was only now seeing the full scope of the trap. The servants came for her at noon, moving with the grim efficiency of men following orders they didn't question. They dragged her by her arms toward the forest's edge, her bare feet scraping against the rough ground, stones cutting into her skin. Her stepmother had commanded it with the casual cruelty of someone who knew absolutely that no one would question her authority, no one would dare report what happened here to any officials who might care. "Take her to the jungle," Stella had said, pointing one manicured finger toward the darkness beyond the village lights. "Leave her there. Let the forest have what it wants. I don't care if she comes back or if she never returns. She is no longer welcome in this house, in this family, in this village." The other children watched from the veranda, her stepbrothers in their fine clothes that Stella's money had bought, her half-sister with her perfectly braided hair and her expression of mingled fear and fascination. None of them moved to stop it. None of them called out to help her. They had learned from Stella that survival meant compliance, that love was conditional and could be withdrawn at any moment if you stepped out of line. Amara stumbled deeper into the jungle that night, soaked through and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her dress hanging in tatters around her. The sounds of the forest surrounded her, the distant call of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth, the constant drip of water from the canopy above. She walked without direction, following no path, just moving away from the village and the life that had been stolen from her. Her body was exhausted, her mind fractured by betrayal and shock. But her legs kept moving forward because stopping meant accepting that this was her fate, that she would die alone in the jungle like an animal abandoned by the herd. And then, when she thought she couldn't go any further, when her vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and pain, she found something that made her stop in her tracks. A structure. Ancient stone walls covered in moss and vines so thick they seemed to be holding the stones together, hidden so deep in the forest that even the local hunters spoke of it only in whispers and half-remembered stories told to frightened children. A temple. Or perhaps a tomb. She didn't know which, and in that moment, exhausted and desperate and abandoned, she didn't care. Amara collapsed against the cool stone, her body giving up what her spirit refused to surrender, her breathing coming in ragged gasps that seemed to echo off the ancient walls. The jungle held its breath around her. The night sounds paused, as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen, as if the universe was holding its breath in anticipation. Amara closed her eyes and waited for sleep to claim her, waited for the darkness to finally take her away from this pain, this betrayal, this unbearable knowledge that she had been abandoned by everyone she loved. But sleep didn't come. Instead, she heard something that made her heart stop cold in her chest. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth toward her hiding place, moving with purpose and direction. Someone or something was coming toward her. She pressed herself further into the shadows of the temple, her breath held so tight her chest ached. The footsteps grew closer. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the ancient stones. A shadow fell across her face, and then a voice, deep, measured, and filled with something that sounded almost like concern. "Don't be afraid," the voice said in the darkness. "I'm not going to hurt you." But before we see who that voice belonged to, we must journey backward through time to understand who Amara truly was, to see the girl beneath the mud and tears, to meet the woman who had been crushed by cruelty but who refused to break under its weight. We must understand the roots from which she grew, the love from which she came, and the loss that shaped her into someone capable of surviving the unsurvivable. Amara was born on a morning when the rain fell upward, or so her mother used to whisper while rocking her to sleep. It was nonsense, of course, the kind of beautiful, impossible thing that mothers told their babies to make them feel special, magical, chosen by the universe itself for greatness. Amara's mother was named Zara, and she was the most beautiful woman in 3 villages, not because of her face, though that was stunning with its high cheekbones and deep, dark eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. No, Zara was beautiful because of the light that came from within her, a light that attracted people like moths to flame, that made strangers feel welcome in her presence, that turned ordinary moments into memories that people carried with them forever. Zara had married Amara's father, Kofi, in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and involved drummers from 5 different tribes and a bride price that had taken Kofi's family 3 full years of labor to gather. The wedding was spoken of in the village for decades afterward as the most beautiful celebration anyone had ever witnessed. Kofi was a man of the earth, someone who understood the language of soil and plants, who could read the seasons and the movements of birds and the patterns of clouds. He owned the largest cocoa plantations in the entire region, sprawling across 40 acres of fertile land where the soil was so rich and dark it seemed to breathe with its own life force. But more than his wealth or his land, Kofi was a man of principle. He paid his workers fairly when others in the region exploited them shamelessly. He celebrated their children's births with gifts and good wishes. He attended their funerals and wept with their families. He was loved not because he was rich, but because he was genuinely, authentically good. and he loved his wife with a devotion so complete and so pure that even the cynical elders would smile and shake their heads in wonder at the sight of them together. Amara grew up running barefoot through those cocoa fields, her small brown feet learning every path, her fingers learning the weight of pods, her sharp eyes trained to spot the ones that were ready for harvest with perfect precision. Her mother taught her the old ways, how to read the forest by the color of the leaves and the songs of the birds, how to speak to the spirits of her ancestors through the morning songs that had been passed down through generations of women, how to heal with herbs and wisdom that modern doctors couldn't understand. Her father taught her numbers and contracts, taught her about business and land ownership, taught her that knowledge was power and integrity was the only currency that truly mattered. Together they showed her a world where tradition and progress could dance together beautifully, where you could honor the past while building a better future, where ancient wisdom and modern thinking could coexist without contradiction. Amara was loved fiercely by both of them, celebrated for her intelligence and her kindness, encouraged to dream dreams that seemed impossible for a village girl. But then, when Amara was only 12 years old, the world cracked open like an egg and everything poured out. Her mother fell ill, a sickness that no doctor could name, no healer could cure, that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her body and consume her from the inside out. Amara watched helplessly as her mother faded day by day, as the light inside her dimmed like a candle running out of wax, as her body became a skeleton wrapped in paper-thin skin. The funeral lasted a week, with women ululating their grief, with drums beating like a broken heart, with the entire village coming to pay their respects to a woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness. Her father wept openly, unashamed, his body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Amara held his hand while he cried, and she herself stopped crying because she understood in that moment that she had to be strong. She had to hold her father together because the grief was threatening to tear him apart completely. For 3 years after her mother's death, Kofi was a man walking through life half awake, a ghost moving through his own existence without truly living. He moved through his days with mechanical precision, tending to his plantations, raising his daughter, conducting his business, but the joy and the light had completely left him. He became quieter, more distant, as if part of him had been buried in the grave with his beloved Zara. Amara tried everything to fill that void, worked harder in the fields than any girl her age, learned her mother's songs by heart and sang them while working, became both daughter and companion to her grieving father. She loved him fiercely, desperately, as if her love alone could bring him back to life, could restore him to the man he had been before loss had consumed him. She cooked his favorite meals. She reminded him of memories they had shared as a family. She tried to be enough for both of them, to be the reason he should get out of bed in the morning and face another day. But she was just a child, and the weight of his grief was too heavy for her small shoulders to carry alone. Then came Stella. She arrived in the village in a car that gleamed like morning dew in the sunlight, dressed in fabrics that cost more than most families earned in an entire year of labor. She was striking, all sharp angles and sharper smiles and eyes that calculated value like a merchant tallying coins. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she deployed her weapons with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. Within 6 months, she had married Kofi in a small ceremony at the courthouse, much to the shock of the village. Within a year, she had 2 children of her own living in the house, and Amara's room had been moved to a smaller space. Within 2 years, Amara realized that her father had chosen his new wife's shadow over his daughter's light. The substitution was complete and total. Stella had never raised a hand to Amara. That wasn't her way at all. She was far too intelligent for such crude violence. Instead, she used words like weapons, planted suggestions like poison, killed with a smile and a whisper. "Amara is so plain, isn't she?" Stella would say to guests, running her perfectly manicured hand through her hair. All that dark skin and those rough hands from working in the fields. "No man will ever want her, you know. She should be grateful that I've taken her in, that I've given her a home and structure." Or she would tell Kofi, "Your father was so foolish with money, sharing with servants, wasting resources on people who don't truly matter. I'm teaching the children to be smarter, to think like real business people." She was subtle and surgical in her cruelty, never overt enough to be called out, never obvious enough to be condemned. Within months, Kofi began to see his own daughter as a burden, an inconvenience, a leftover from his first marriage that refused to fade gracefully into the background. Amara watched it happen and couldn't stop it, watched the love in her father's eyes transform into indifference and then coldness. She watched him favor his new children over her, attend their ceremonies while missing hers, laugh loudly at their jokes while her words fell into a void of silence. She knew, with the certainty of someone who understands the cruelty of loss, that she had lost her father long before Stella's cruelty came out into the open. The man who had taught her about integrity and love had chosen a beautiful lie over an inconvenient truth. He had chosen comfort over principle, and in doing so, he had abandoned his own daughter. Amara tried harder. She worked in the fields without complaining. She never spoke back to Stella. She tried to be invisible, hoping that somehow, if she could just disappear, maybe her father would miss her, would remember her, would choose her again. When Kofi died, suddenly, without warning, his heart stopping in the middle of the night, like a clock that had simply run down, Amara was 17 years old and unprepared for the final blow that fate had been saving for her. His will was clear and unambiguous, written years ago when he was still a man of principle, still a man who remembered his first marriage and his first daughter. The will stated with absolute clarity that the plantations, the house, the ancestral lands, all of his accumulated wealth and property would go to Amara upon her 18th birthday. Stella was granted only a widow's portion and guardianship of Amara until that date. It was a final act of love, a father reaching back from death to protect the daughter he had failed while living. But it was also a death sentence, because Stella had seen that will, and Stella was a woman who would destroy anything, anyone, to keep what she had stolen, what she believed was rightfully hers by virtue of her beauty and her cunning. The year before her 18th birthday was a descent into hell, disguised as a home, a cage that grew smaller and tighter with each passing day. Stella's cruelty escalated in carefully calculated waves, each one more sophisticated and devastating than the last. First came the social betrayal, the systematic destruction of Amara's standing in the community. Stella invited all the families of importance, government officials, wealthy merchants, the pastor and his wife, the judge who would oversee the reading of the will, to a grand dinner at the family estate. She displayed Amara like a prize being auctioned to the highest bidder, pointing out her flaws with the precision of a surgeon performing an operation. "Such a shame she has no grace or refinement," Stella would say, while Amara served drinks. "No education beyond what her simple deceased father could provide. And so stubborn, she refuses to learn the ways of refined society. I've tried my best, but some people are simply incapable of improvement." The families left with their minds poisoned, their opinions of Amara completely transformed by Stella's calculated performance. Within weeks, the landscape of Amara's social world had changed completely. The invitations that used to arrive regularly to dances and ceremonies and community gatherings dried up as if a tap had been shut off. The young men who had once waited for her at the village well hoping for a chance to talk to her, now looked through her as if she were invisible, as if she were a ghost that existed only in their peripheral vision. The girls who had been her friends since childhood crossed the street to avoid her, unable or unwilling to stand against the current of opinion that Stella had created. Amara found herself utterly alone, cut off from her community, marked with a shame that she didn't deserve and couldn't escape. Stella had done it perfectly, with such precision and such subtlety that no one could accuse her of wrongdoing. She had simply shared her concerns about the poor girl, expressed her worries about Amara's future, and let the village do the rest. But the social destruction was only the beginning. Stella was far too ambitious to settle for merely making Amara an outcast. She needed to ensure that there was nothing for Amara to inherit when her 18th birthday arrived. Amara discovered the first forged document quite by accident, stumbling upon it while reviewing the plantation accounts as her father had taught her to do. Her blood turned to ice in her veins as she read her father's signature, unmistakable, perfect in every detail, on a document transferring a significant portion of the plantation to Stella's name. But it was wrong. Amara recognized immediately the handwriting of the plantation manager, who was close with Stella and had everything to gain from pleasing her. Her father would never have written such a thing, never have transferred his ancestral lands to anyone. She confronted Stella that evening, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury that she couldn't quite control. Stella's response was laughter. Cold, cruel laughter that echoed through the house like the cry of a vulture circling carrion. "Who would believe you?" Stella asked, her eyes glittering with absolute certainty, with the confidence of someone who had already won, who was simply playing out the final moves of a game that was already decided. "You're just a girl, Amara. A poor, uneducated girl with no witnesses, no allies, no proof that matters to anyone who could help you. The manager will swear it's genuine. The lawyers already have. I've paid them well. And your father is dead. Dead men can't contradict what I've written in their names." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than her shouts. "By the time your birthday arrives, there will be nothing left for you to inherit. Nothing but your father's debts. I've taken out loans against the land. I've mortgaged the house. I've created a financial structure so complex that it will take lawyers years to untangle it. You'll inherit nothing but ruin." That's when Amara realized the full scope of what was happening, the complete and utter scope of Stella's plan. It wasn't just about stealing the money. It was about erasing her. Stella intended to rewrite history itself, to make it as if Kofi's first marriage, his first daughter, his first love, none of it had ever mattered. She was going to steal not just the land and the wealth, but Amara's very identity, her place in the family, her right to her father's legacy. She would redefine who Amara was and where she came from, turning her into a criminal and a liar in the eyes of the world. But there was one thing Stella hadn't counted on, one resource that she couldn't control or manipulate. There was Amara's great-uncle, her father's younger brother, who lived in the capital city and was a lawyer of considerable reputation and principle. He was known throughout the region as a man who couldn't be bribed, who believed in justice, who took on cases that others abandoned. Amara wrote to him in secret, using a trader who passed through the village regularly, detailing everything that had happened, everything that Stella had done. She enclosed copies of Ife's photographs, of the forged documents, the plantation manager's written confessions, everything that might help prove her case. She begged him to come before her 18th birthday, when the will would be read officially, to stand with her, to help her fight against the conspiracy that had been woven around her. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into a month. She heard nothing from her great-uncle, and then, 3 weeks before her birthday, as if the universe was conspiring against her, she overheard a conversation that shattered what little hope remained. Stella was on the telephone with someone, her great-uncle's law firm, Amara realized with horror. She heard Stella's voice, honeyed and intimate. "Yes, I've been expecting your call." "Such a shame about my stepdaughter's lies. She's troubled, you understand. Unstable, making wild accusations to cover her own theft from the family accounts." Stella continued her poisonous recitation to the lawyer. "I have documents proving her mental instability. Witness statements from village leaders about her erratic behavior. I'm attempting to help her, but she's bent on extorting money from me, claiming that the will is fraudulent, that her late father was somehow manipulated into excluding her favorite nephew." Amara stood frozen in the shadows, listening as Stella manufactured a case against her, so convincing, so layered with false evidence and fabricated witnesses, that even her own family had begun to believe she was a criminal and a liar. The great-uncle had been turned completely to Stella's side. He believed that his niece was troubled, that she was attempting some kind of con, that she was unworthy of the inheritance. Amara understood in that moment the final depth of her betrayal. It wasn't just her stepmother who had turned against her. It wasn't just her father who had chosen comfort over principle. It was the entire system, the lawyers, the officials, the judges, the people who were supposed to protect her. They had all chosen the beautiful woman with money over the orphaned girl with only the truth. But then, in the darkness of despair, something unexpected happened, something that would change everything and set the stage for a climax that no one could have predicted. A letter arrived, not from the great-uncle, but from the plantation manager's daughter, Eve. They had been friends once, before Stella's poison had spread through the village like a disease, infecting everyone it touched. Eve had spent months wrestling with her conscience, watching her father forge documents, watching Stella manipulate and scheme, watching her own family become complicit in a great evil that grew more monstrous with each passing day. She had finally broken under the weight of her guilt and her shame. She had taken photographs of all the forged documents, gathered her father's notes and written confessions hidden away in a drawer, and written a detailed account of every deception and every manipulation. She sent it all to Amara with a note written in her careful hand. "I couldn't let you die alone in silence. My father was weak, but I won't be. I'm leaving this village. I'm going to a city where no one knows my shame. But you fight. You survive. You win." Amara held that letter like a lifeline, like a rope thrown to her as she drowned in an ocean of lies and manipulation. She read it over and over, drawing strength from Eve's words, understanding that there was at least one person who believed in her, who had risked everything to tell the truth. But it was too late. She had no time to find a lawyer who would believe her story, no way to present this evidence before the will-reading ceremony. She had 48 hours, just 2 days until everything would be decided. And then Stella made her final, fatal move, the one that would seal her own fate, even as she believed she was sealing Amara's. The stepmother arrived in Amara's room late at night, her face twisted with something beyond greed, beyond cruelty. It was fear. Stella was afraid. She was terrified that somehow, against all odds, Amara might still win. And fear made her careless, made her abandon her carefully constructed mask of civility. "You think you're clever," Stella hissed, backing Amara toward the window, her voice sharp with hysteria. "You think your pathetic letter from that fool girl will save you. I've already paid off the judge. I've already prepared the documents declaring you mentally unfit, incompetent, unable to manage your inheritance. By tomorrow, you'll be nothing, less than nothing, a vagrant, a mad woman. No one will believe a word you say. Your great-uncle is already convinced you're a criminal." She grabbed Amara's arm, her nails drawing blood, her strength born of desperation and rage. "Your father would be so ashamed of what you've become. A burden, a shame to his memory, a girl who can't even hold onto her own inheritance." But in that moment, as Amara stared into her stepmother's eyes, she saw something that changed everything. She saw Stella's true fear, and it wasn't about money at all. It was the fear of being discovered, of being known for what she truly was, a predator, a killer, a woman who had destroyed lives for greed. In that instant of clarity, Amara understood exactly what had to happen. She pulled away from Stella's grasp with strength she didn't know she possessed and ran. She ran to the forest. She ran toward the ancient temple where she had discovered something else during her late-night wanderings, something that would either save her or destroy her completely. In that moment, as she fled into the darkness, with only the sound of her stepmother's rage behind her, echoing through the corridors of the house like the screams of a banshee, Amara didn't know which it would be. All she knew was that staying in that house was death. Running was her only choice. She ran until her lungs burned, until every muscle in her body screamed for mercy, until the village lights were gone, until there was nothing but darkness and the distant sound of drums that only she could hear. The temple was not a tomb, and it was not abandoned. That became abundantly clear when the torchlight found Amara huddled against its ancient stones, shivering and bleeding and broken, and a voice spoke her name. Not girl or woman, but her actual name. Amara. She looked up, terrified, and saw a face that seemed impossible in that moment. A man, perhaps 30 years old, with eyes that held both gentleness and the weight of impossible responsibility. He was dressed in expensive clothes that seemed entirely out of place in this jungle sanctuary, his tie loosened, his jacket discarded somewhere in the darkness behind him. His name was Kofi, and he was a billionaire, owner of vast agricultural enterprises, technology companies, and investments across the African continent. But more importantly, he was a man searching for something he couldn't name. He came to this temple every month, to the place where his own ancestors had been buried centuries before, seeking wisdom and clarity in the old ways. Kofi listened to Amara's story without interruption, his eyes growing darker with each revelation of cruelty and betrayal. He listened to the betrayal by her stepmother, the forged documents, the stolen inheritance, the manipulation of her great-uncle, the poisoning of the entire community against her. He listened to the fear in her voice and saw the strength beneath it, the steel that wouldn't break even when everything else had shattered into pieces. He heard the love she still carried for her father, despite his abandonment of her, the respect she still had for her family, despite their betrayal. When she finished her story, exhausted and crying, Kofi made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives forever. "I have lawyers," he said, "the best lawyers in the country. We're going to the city tonight. We're going to present that evidence Ife sent you, and we're going to make sure your stepmother answers for what she's done. I promise you, Amara, justice will come." But it wasn't that simple, and Kofi knew it. Nothing ever is when the entire system has been corrupted. As Kofi drove Amara toward the capital city in his car, a vehicle so luxurious it seemed to float above the roads, so quiet inside you could barely hear the engine running, she told him about the will-reading ceremony scheduled for the next morning at 8 o'clock. It would happen in the presence of the judge that Stella had already paid off, in a courtroom where the outcome had already been decided. By then, all the documents would be signed, all the transfers finalized. Stella would own everything. Amara would own nothing. They had perhaps 6 hours to stop it, and the odds were impossibly, terrifyingly steep. The legal system had already been corrupted. The judge was bought and paid for. The great-uncle had been turned against her. and there was no way to go through normal channels because the normal channels had been poisoned from top to bottom. Kofi made phone calls through the night, working his connections and his wealth like a general deploying troops in a complex military operation. He called judges he knew personally, officials he had dealings with, newspaper editors and television producers who owed him favors. By 4 in the morning, a plan had formed. Not a legal plan, because there wasn't time for that, but something more powerful, something that would force the truth into the light, where lies couldn't survive in the brightness of public exposure. They arrived at the courthouse just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And what happened next would be talked about in that village and beyond for generations. The will reading was supposed to be a private affair, attended only by family and the corrupt judge. But when Stella arrived, dressed in a white dress that mimicked mourning while her eyes gleamed with triumph, she found the courthouse steps crowded with journalists, television cameras, and photographers. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. The story had already gone out to the world. Billionaire Kofi Mensah challenges inheritance fraud in landmark case. Will demand justice for betrayed stepdaughter. Stella's face went white. The color drained from her cheeks, like water from a broken vessel. She tried to turn back toward her car, but there was nowhere to go, no escape route, no way to hide. The judge who had been paid off suddenly found his conscience under the weight of so much public scrutiny, under the knowledge that his corruption would be exposed to the entire world if he tried to proceed. He called for the ceremony to proceed publicly with full media coverage, with his decisions recorded and documented and broadcast live on television. The evidence came out like a flood breaking through a dam. Ife's photographs of the forged documents, the plantation manager's own confessions, records of payments Stella had made to officials, emails between Stella and corrupt lawyers plotting the scheme. And then came the bombshell that made even the cynical journalists gasp in shock. Kofi's investigators had uncovered something else during their frantic overnight research, a pattern of similar crimes spanning years. Stella had done this before, not once, but twice, with 2 previous husbands, both now dead under suspicious circumstances, both having willed their estates to her before mysterious illnesses claimed their lives. The deaths had been investigated at the time, but the investigations had been closed quickly, suspiciously, with no charges ever filed. Now, with new evidence and renewed scrutiny, those cases were being reopened. The authorities began looking into the deaths more carefully, examining medical records, questioning witnesses who had been silent before. Stella's mask cracked like ancient pottery exposed to the sun. She stood up in the courtroom and screamed denials, accusations, rage. She pointed at Amara and said she was a liar, a deceiver, a witch who had seduced Kofi to gain his help. She swore that the documents were real, that she was innocent, that she was being persecuted by jealousy and lies. But her words fell into a void. No one was listening anymore. The judge declared the will valid exactly as it had been originally written by Kofi years before. The stolen documents were deemed fraudulent. The money that Stella had transferred to herself was to be returned immediately to Amara's inheritance. And then came the final blow, the one that would echo through the village for generations to come. The judge, his voice steady now, with the weight of true justice rather than corruption, ordered Stella's immediate arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit inheritance theft. As the police officers moved forward to take her into custody, Stella's carefully constructed world collapsed entirely. She lunged toward Amara with such fury that it took 3 officers to restrain her, her perfectly manicured nails raking the air like claws. Her voice transformed into something animal and desperate. "You were nothing," she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You were supposed to be nothing. A forgotten girl in a forgotten village. How dare you? How dare you stand against me?" But Amara stood silent, her back straight, her eyes dry of tears. She had no words for the woman who had tried to erase her from existence. She simply watched as Stella was led away in handcuffs, watched as the woman who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was reduced to exactly what she had always been, beneath the beautiful mask. A frightened, greedy woman who had built her empire on the graves of others, and who would now face the consequences of every cruel choice she had ever made. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, interviews with investigators, and the slow, painful process of reclaiming what had been stolen from her. The plantation manager was arrested and gave a full confession, his guilt overwhelming his fear of consequences. The corrupt officials who had taken Stella's bribes were exposed one by one, their careers ending in shame and criminal charges. The great-uncle came to Amara in person, his face aged by shame and regret, to apologize for believing Stella's lies, for abandoning his brother's daughter when she needed him most. Amara forgave him, because that's who she was, someone who understood that forgiveness was not about excusing the harm done, but about releasing herself from the burden of carrying hatred in her heart. The village that had turned its back on her now came forward with apologies, with explanations of how they had been manipulated, how they had been afraid. Some of these apologies Amara accepted, others she did not. She had learned that forgiveness was a gift freely given, not an obligation owed to those who ask for it. The stepbrothers and half-sister who had watched her being dragged to the jungle wrote letters begging for her understanding, claiming they had been too young, too frightened, too controlled by their mother to help her. Amara read those letters and felt only emptiness where anger should have been. They had made their choices. She would make hers. She restored the cocoa plantations to their former glory, implementing fair wages and profit-sharing systems that her father had once dreamed of but never fully realized. She opened schools for the village children, ensured medical care for the workers and their families, built infrastructure that transformed the entire region. She became exactly what her father had hoped she would be, not just an inheritor of wealth, but a guardian of justice and a champion for those who had no voice. And Kofi stayed. He came to the village every week at first, ostensibly to check on the legal proceedings, to ensure that justice was being properly served. But Amara knew the truth, and so did he, though neither spoke it aloud for many months. He was drawn to her in a way that transcended gratitude or obligation, drawn to the strength he saw in her, the resilience that had survived betrayal and abandonment, and still emerged with compassion intact. They would walk through the cocoa fields in the early morning, when the air was still cool and filled with birdsong, and they would talk about everything and nothing, about his businesses and her plans for the plantation, about philosophy and poetry, about their dreams for Africa's future and their memories of the past. Slowly, carefully, like two people who had both been wounded and were learning to trust again, they built something that neither had expected to find. Love came quietly, without drama or grand declarations. It came in shared silences and understanding glances, in the way Kofi would bring her coffee in the morning, exactly as she liked it without having to ask, in the way Amara would laugh at his terrible jokes, even when they weren't funny, because she loved seeing him smile. One evening, as they sat on the veranda of the restored family home, watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors, Kofi took her hand in his and said simply, "I want to spend my life with you. Not because I saved you. I didn't save you, Amara. You saved yourself. I just happened to be there when you needed a witness to your strength. I want to be that witness forever. I want to build a life with you, raise children with you, grow old beside you, if you'll have me." Amara looked at this man who had appeared in her darkest moment like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to voice, and she smiled, the first truly free, truly joyful smile she had smiled since before her mother died. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll have you. On one condition, that we build something together that honors where we came from while reaching toward where we want to go. That we never forget what injustice looks like, and we never stop fighting it wherever we find it." 3 years later, Amara stood in the exact spot where she had once collapsed, against ancient temple stones, bleeding and abandoned and certain that her life was over. But now she stood in a white dress that wasn't torn, with flowers in her hair and joy in her heart, surrounded by hundreds of people who had come to celebrate her marriage to Kofi in a ceremony that honored both the old ways and the new. The temple had been restored, transformed into a community center and school where children learned about their history and their heritage, where the ancient wisdom was passed down alongside modern education. Stella was in prison, serving a 20-year sentence for her crimes, and the investigations into her previous husband's deaths had yielded enough evidence to add murder charges that would ensure she never walked free again. But Amara rarely thought of her stepmother anymore. She had learned that the opposite of love wasn't hate, it was indifference. She had moved beyond the woman who had tried to destroy her, had built a life so full and so meaningful that there was no room left for bitterness or revenge. As the drums beat and the dancers moved in patterns that her mother had once taught her, as Kofi took her hand and they walked through the gathered crowd to begin their new life together, Amara thought about the girl she had been, abandoned in the jungle, broken and bleeding, certain that death was coming for her. That girl had been so afraid, so certain that she had lost everything. But that girl had been wrong. She hadn't lost everything. She had lost only the things that were already broken, already poisoned, already dead. And in losing them, she had found herself. She had found her strength, her voice, her purpose. She had found love. Not the conditional love that could be withdrawn at any moment, but the kind of love that was chosen freely, every single day. As the sun set over the cocoa fields and the celebration continued into the night, Amara whispered a prayer of gratitude to her mother's spirit and her father's memory. She thanked them for the gifts they had given her mother's wisdom and her father's final act of protection through his will, and she promised them that she would honor their legacy, not through bitterness or revenge, but through building something beautiful, something worthy of the love they had once shown her before the world had torn them apart. The rain that had witnessed her abandonment now fell gently on her wedding day, and Amara smiled, remembering her mother's impossible story. Perhaps the rain really had fallen upward on the day she was born. Perhaps she really had been chosen by the universe for something greater than survival. Perhaps every moment of suffering had been preparing her for this, not just for happiness, but for the wisdom to recognize it when it arrived, and the strength to protect it once it was found. She was Amara. She was loved. She was free. And her story, the story of a girl thrown into the jungle like trash, who rose from that darkness to become a woman of power, compassion, and unshakable strength, was just beginning.